The moment a goddess remembered her creator, an empire forgot how to breathe. The Hall of Celestial Accord stretched for nearly half a mile beneath a transparent dome of crystal and living alloy. Above it, stars shimmered across the darkness of space like scattered diamonds. Thousands of representatives from hundreds of worlds filled the vast chamber. Some wore royal robes woven from luminous fibers. Others carried ceremonial staffs, ancient symbols, or banners bearing the history of civilizations older than many suns. Yet every eye remained fixed on a single figure seated at the center of the hall. Queen Elora. To some, she was a monarch. To others, she was a savior. To many across the galaxy, she had become something far greater. A living goddess. Soft silver light reflected from her turquoise blue skin. Her long white hair flowed across the back of a throne carved from crystal grown over generations. Her violet eyes seemed to hold entire constellations within them. Around her stood guards, advisors, and diplomats, all maintaining perfect silence while the annual convocation of worlds prepared to begin. The atmosphere felt sacred, ancient, eternal. Then the human entered. Most people barely noticed him. Why would they? Ethan Ward walked through the enormous chamber, carrying a maintenance toolkit beneath one arm. His dark utility jacket looked worn from years of use. His boots carried faint traces of machine oil. A few delegates moved aside as he passed, assuming he was another technician assigned to maintain the hall's environmental systems. He looked ordinary, small against the scale of the chamber. Almost invisible. Ethan seemed perfectly comfortable with that. He approached the central platform while advisors continued discussing ceremonial procedures. The Queen's attention remained focused on diplomatic reports resting beside her throne. Nobody expected anything unusual. Then Ethan reached the base of the platform. Without hesitation, he lowered himself onto one knee. Silence arrived instantly. Conversations stopped. Advisors froze. Even distant observers felt the shift move through the hall like a wave. A human kneeling before the Queen was not shocking. Thousands had done so before. Yet something about this moment felt different. Ethan bowed his head respectfully. Then he spoke 6 quiet words. "The stars still shine, little light." The sentence was barely above a whisper. Most of the chamber never heard it. Queen Elora did. Her expression changed immediately. Not dramatically, just enough. One heartbeat earlier she had looked calm and regal. The next, something unfamiliar appeared behind her eyes. Surprise. Her gaze locked onto the kneeling human. Ethan remained motionless. Around them, nobody understood why the air suddenly felt heavier. Advisors exchanged confused glances. Several guards shifted uneasily. Queen Elora stared at Ethan as though she had heard a voice from another lifetime. Somewhere deep inside her mind, beneath years of memory and responsibility, a forgotten image flickered into existence. A bright room, white lights, transparent glass, a warm human voice speaking gently through static. The vision vanished almost instantly, yet the feeling remained. She knew those words. Somehow, impossibly, she knew them. Ethan slowly raised his head. Their eyes met across the distance, separating a queen from a technician. For a brief moment, the hall disappeared. The stars above seemed to fade. There was only confusion in the eyes of a goddess and quiet sadness in the eyes of a human. Then the ceremonial bells rang across the chamber, breaking the moment. Delegates resumed breathing. Advisors returned to their duties. The convocation began. Yet Queen Elora barely heard the opening announcements. Her attention remained fixed on one impossible question. How did a forgotten human know words she remembered from a memory that should not exist? Queen Elora heard almost nothing during the remainder of the convocation. Delegates spoke about trade routes, resource agreements, and cultural exchanges. Advisors presented reports projected across floating displays of light. Applause echoed through the immense chamber at carefully scheduled moments. Yet her attention kept drifting toward a single question. The words. The 6 impossible words. She had heard them before. Not in a speech. Not in a historical archive. Somewhere deeper. Somewhere older. The feeling followed her long after the ceremony ended. Hours later, while much of the palace settled into evening routines, Ethan Ward sat alone in a maintenance corridor beneath the Hall of Celestial Accord. The corridor was narrow, warm, and filled with the quiet hum of environmental systems. Tool cases rested beside him while diagnostic screens displayed airflow readings and energy consumption data. He adjusted a calibration sequence, sipped coffee from a plain metal cup, and returned to work. To anyone passing by, he looked exactly like what his identification badge claimed he was. A senior systems technician. Nothing more. Nothing less. Above him, the palace glowed beneath the light of distant stars. Below him, pumps circulated clean water throughout residential sectors. Ethan preferred working there. Machines were honest. They either functioned or they did not. People were usually more complicated. Meanwhile, Queen Elora dismissed her final advisors and retreated to a private observation chamber overlooking the capital. The city stretched for miles beneath her. Towers of crystal and living metal reflected rivers of light into the night sky. Millions of citizens continued their lives below. They trusted her. They believed in her. Some even worshipped her. Yet none of them could answer the question now occupying her thoughts. She approached a memory archive interface built into the chamber wall. The system activated instantly. "Access personal cognitive records," she said softly. The archive obeyed. Thousands of memories appeared. Celebrations, diplomatic missions, childhood education sequences, state ceremonies, years of history carefully preserved. She searched for the phrase, "The stars still shine, little light." No results appeared. Elora frowned. That should have been impossible. She remembered hearing it. Not imagining it. Hearing it. The certainty unsettled her. She expanded the search into older memory sectors. Deep sectors. The earliest records available. A warning icon appeared immediately. Restricted Developmental Archive. Elora stared at the message. Developmental Archive. The term felt strangely unfamiliar despite belonging to her own records. Slowly, she opened the protected section. Most files were corrupted. Others had been sealed by permissions older than her reign. Yet one fragment remained accessible. Only 8 seconds long. A blurred image emerged on the display. White light. Transparent glass. Static interference. Then a human voice. Warm. Patient. Gentle. "Easy now, little light." Elora froze. The recording ended. Silence filled the chamber. Her pulse accelerated. The voice sounded older. Younger. Different. Yet somehow familiar. She replayed the fragment. Again. 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 Each repetition strengthened a feeling she could not explain. Somewhere inside that distorted voice lived a connection reaching beyond memory itself. At that same moment, several levels below the palace, Ethan finished repairing a filtration unit and gathered his tools. He paused briefly beside a viewport overlooking the sleeping city. The lights reflected in his tired eyes. Then he smiled quietly to himself and continued walking. He had no idea that a forgotten memory had just awakened. Nor did he know that the queen was now searching for a ghost hidden somewhere inside her own past. By the next morning, rumors had already begun spreading through the palace. Not about politics. Not about trade agreements. About the queen. More specifically, about her sudden interest in a maintenance technician whose name had never appeared in any official discussion before. Advisors noticed the change immediately. Queen Elora was normally precise, focused, and impossible to distract. Yet throughout the morning she paused during briefings, reread reports she had already approved, and occasionally drifted into silence while staring through the towering windows of the palace. Every time it happened, the same image returned. White light, transparent glass, a warm human voice. "Easy now, little light." The phrase echoed through her thoughts like a distant song she almost remembered. Finally, unable to ignore the feeling any longer, Elora ordered a complete review of her earliest developmental records. The request surprised even the palace archive director. "Your Majesty," the elderly advisor said carefully, "those records are centuries old. Then we should preserve them. Many were intentionally sealed. Then I would like to know why." The advisor lowered his gaze and immediately began processing the request. Hours later, deep beneath the palace, ancient archive systems awakened for the first time in generations. Data crystals illuminated forgotten corridors. Preservation chambers opened. Historical databases synchronized with modern networks. Somewhere inside those silent vaults, answers waited. Meanwhile, Ethan Ward spent the day exactly as he always did. He repaired a faulty climate regulator in a residential sector. He recalibrated atmospheric sensors in a public transit hub. He stopped to help a group of children restart an educational display that had frozen during a science presentation. The children thanked him enthusiastically. Ethan thanked them for being patient. Then he continued on his way, carrying his weathered toolkit beneath one arm. Nothing about him suggested mystery. Nothing suggested significance. Most people who passed him never looked twice. Ethan preferred it that way. Late in the afternoon, he climbed a maintenance ladder leading to an observation deck near the palace gardens. The deck overlooked miles of green terraces, flowing water channels, and flowering trees imported from dozens of worlds. The view always helped him think. He sat on a bench overlooking the gardens and opened a small notebook. Unlike most citizens, Ethan still preferred paper. The notebook contained sketches, engineering ideas, and occasional thoughts he never shared with anyone else. He turned several pages before stopping on an old drawing. The image showed a circular chamber filled with light. At the center stood a transparent containment pod. Ethan stared at the sketch for a long moment. His expression softened. Then he quietly closed the notebook and slipped it back into his jacket. Across the palace, Queen Elora finally received the first archive report. The file contained no explanations, no summaries, only a date, a project designation, and a name. Genesis Crown. Elora felt her pulse quicken. She had never heard the term before, yet somehow it felt familiar. Beneath the project title appeared a list of personnel. Most names meant nothing to her. Then she reached the final entry. Lead architect, Ethan Ward. The room became silent. Elora stared at the screen. The maintenance technician. The quiet human who repaired air systems and avoided attention. His name existed inside records older than her reign. Older than some governments. Older than entire political alliances. Slowly, she looked toward the palace window where evening sunlight painted the city gold. For the first time, a possibility emerged that seemed too impossible to believe and too consistent to ignore. Somewhere inside the forgotten history of Genesis Crown, the story of her own existence might be waiting. The archives opened one layer at a time. Each new section required permissions that had not been used for decades. Deep beneath the palace, preservation systems hummed softly as forgotten records awakened from centuries of silence. Queen Elora sat alone in the archive chamber, surrounded by floating displays of light. Advisors had offered to assist. She declined. Whatever waited inside Genesis Crown felt personal now. The chamber remained quiet except for the distant sound of data systems processing ancient information. One file finally unlocked. Then another. Then dozens more. Elora began reading. At first, the documents resembled technical reports, development schedules, resource allocations, scientific evaluations. Yet as she moved deeper into the archive, a different picture emerged. Genesis Crown had never been intended as a weapon. It had never been intended as a government project. It had been created during one of the darkest periods in galactic history. Entire regions had suffered from instability. Leadership failures had shattered alliances. Trust between civilizations had nearly disappeared. The archive described a desperate search for something almost impossible. Not a ruler, not a soldier, a symbol, a living example capable of uniting people who no longer believed in one another. Elora felt a strange sensation as she continued reading. Many of the project's design principles sounded familiar. Compassion before authority, curiosity before judgment, service before power. Those values had guided her entire reign. Yet these documents were far older than her earliest memories. A final report opened. Attached to it was a recording. The image flickered into existence. A laboratory. White walls. Soft lighting. Scientists moving between consoles. Then the camera settled on a younger human standing beside a transparent chamber filled with glowing light. Ethan Ward. He looked different. Younger. His hair darker. His face less worn by time. Yet there was no mistaking him. The recording continued. Status report? Someone asked from behind the camera. Ethan glanced toward the chamber. Cognitive development is progressing normally. And the ethical framework? Ethan smiled faintly. Better than expected. Several people laughed quietly. Then Ethan stepped closer to the transparent chamber. The camera angle shifted. For the first time, Elora saw what rested inside. A young figure surrounded by streams of light. Small, fragile, not yet fully developed. Her breath caught. The figure looked unmistakably familiar. The recording ended abruptly. Silence filled the archive chamber. Elora stared at the empty display. For several seconds, she could not move. She replayed the recording. Then again. Every time, the same feeling returned. Not shock, not fear. Recognition. Somewhere deep inside her earliest memories, she knew that laboratory. She knew that voice. She knew the warmth she felt whenever Ethan spoke. Suddenly, another fragment surfaced inside her mind. A memory she had never questioned before. A human hand resting against transparent glass. A voice speaking gently through static. You are going to help people someday. Elora closed her eyes. The memory vanished almost immediately, yet its emotional weight remained. Above the archive chamber, life throughout the palace continued normally. Ethan spent the afternoon repairing environmental controls in a residential district for retired workers. He carried replacement components through narrow hallways, accepted thanks from grateful residents, and stopped to help an elderly caretaker reset a malfunctioning garden system. He had no idea what the Queen was discovering. No idea that pieces of a forgotten history were beginning to reconnect. As evening settled across the capital, Elora finally looked away from the display. One truth had become impossible to ignore. The mystery was no longer whether Ethan was connected to Genesis Crown. The mystery was why the man who helped create the most revered figure in the galaxy had chosen to disappear into the background and let history forget his name. The deeper Queen Elora searched, the stranger the story became. Genesis Crown was not a single project. It was thousands of decisions spread across years of research, engineering, ethics reviews, and cultural studies. Entire teams had contributed to its development. Scientists from dozens of worlds, philosophers, educators, historians. Yet one name appeared more often than any other. Ethan Ward. Sometimes he was listed as lead architect, sometimes as systems designer, sometimes simply as Ethan. The familiarity surprised her. Ancient projects normally spoke through titles and ranks. These records spoke about him as if everyone involved knew him personally. Late that evening, another archive finally unlocked. This one contained internal communications rather than technical reports. Elora began reading. The messages painted a very different picture than the formal records. One scientist described Ethan as frustratingly stubborn. Another called him impossible to discourage. A third praised his unusual ability to solve problems nobody else noticed. Yet one comment appeared repeatedly throughout the archive. He always asks the same question. Curious, Elora continued reading until she found the explanation. Whenever the team debated a design decision, Ethan reportedly asked a single question before approving it. Will this help people? The simplicity of the phrase unsettled her. Entire civilizations had spent centuries debating leadership models. Ethan had reduced the problem to 5 words. She opened another file. This one contained meeting transcripts. Once again, the same pattern emerged. Technical discussions became ethical discussions. Ethical discussions became human discussions. Every path eventually returned to the same question. Will this help people? Slowly, Elora began understanding something important. Genesis Crown had not been built around intelligence. It had not been built around power. It had been built around compassion. The realization made her unexpectedly emotional. Throughout her reign, citizens often praised her wisdom. Advisors praised her diplomacy. Historians praised her influence. Yet the values guiding those achievements had not appeared from nowhere. Someone had placed them there long before she ever sat upon a throne. Meanwhile, Ethan spent the evening in a quiet maintenance workshop overlooking the outer districts of the capital. Rain tapped softly against the windows while diagnostic displays glowed across workbenches filled with tools and replacement components. He repaired a damaged environmental regulator while an old radio played classical music from Earth. The scene felt peaceful, familiar. Home. A young apprentice entered carrying several data tablets. Mr. Ward? Ethan looked up. Yes. How do you always know which system will fail first? The apprentice sounded genuinely curious. Ethan smiled. I do not. Then how do you find the problems? Ethan tightened a connector and sat back. Most people look at machines when they stop working. That makes sense. I look at them before they stop working. The apprentice considered the answer for several seconds. Then he nodded slowly. That sounds difficult. Ethan laughed quietly. Not really. You just have to pay attention. The apprentice thanked him and left. Ethan returned to his work. He never realized how closely his answer resembled the philosophy hidden throughout Genesis Crown. Pay attention. Notice what others miss. Help before people ask. Across the palace, Elora opened one final archive entry before ending the night. A personal note written by Ethan himself. Unlike the official records, it contained no technical language. Only a single paragraph. If this project succeeds, I hope she becomes better than we are. Better than me. The words struck her harder than any report she had read. Not because they revealed genius. Because they revealed humility. For the first time since beginning her search, Queen Elora stopped looking at Ethan Ward as a creator. She began seeing him as something far rarer. A man who had built hope and then stepped aside so it could belong to everyone else. The final barrier opened just after midnight. Queen Elora sat alone in the archive chamber while the palace slept above her. Most of the lights had dimmed. The city beyond the crystal walls glowed softly beneath rivers of stars. For hours, she had followed fragments of history scattered across centuries. Reports led to recordings. Recordings led to personal notes. Personal notes led to sealed developmental files. Now she had reached the deepest layer of Genesis' crown. A warning appeared across the display. Core origin records. Authorization required. Elora placed her hand against the interface. The system recognized her immediately. The archive unlocked. Silence filled the chamber. Then the first recording appeared. Unlike the polished presentations found elsewhere in the project, this one looked unfinished. The camera image shook slightly. Equipment cluttered the background. Researchers moved between workstations carrying tablets and diagnostic tools. The atmosphere felt less like a government program and more like a group of exhausted people trying desperately to build something meaningful before time ran out. Ethan stood near the center of the room. He looked younger than the man who now repaired environmental systems beneath the palace. Yet his eyes were identical. Calm, focused, kind. Someone off camera asked a question. What if she becomes more influential than any leader in history? Ethan smiled faintly. Then I hope she uses that influence wisely. Another voice responded. And if people start worshiping her? Several researchers laughed. Ethan did not. He looked toward a transparent chamber glowing softly behind him. Then we failed to teach them the point. The room became quiet. What point? Someone finally asked. Ethan folded his arms. The goal was never to create someone people would follow. His gaze remained fixed on the chamber. The goal was to create someone who would teach them how to care about each other. Elora felt something tighten in her chest. She continued watching. More recordings followed. In every one, the same pattern emerged. Scientists discussed intelligence. Ethan discussed empathy. Others focused on capability. Ethan focused on responsibility. When debates became complicated, he always returned to the same principle. Help people. Understand people. Protect dignity. Preserve hope. Eventually, the final recording appeared. The timestamp identified it as one of the last entries before Genesis' crown concluded. Ethan stood alone beside the transparent chamber. The young figure inside looked almost complete now. Silver hair. Turquoise blue skin. Closed eyes. Peaceful expression. Elora stared at the image. It felt like looking backward through her own existence. The recording continued. Ethan rested his hand gently against the glass. You probably will not remember this. His voice carried a quiet warmth. That is all right. He smiled. You were never meant to remember me. The words hit harder than anything she had heard so far. Ethan continued speaking. You were meant to remember what matters. For a moment, he simply stood there. Then he added something so softly that the archive nearly failed to capture it. The stars still shine, little light. Tears formed in Elora's eyes before she even realized it. The recording ended. Silence returned. Across the city, Ethan sat alone on a maintenance platform overlooking the sleeping capital. A cup of coffee rested beside him. The night air carried the scent of rain. Below, millions of citizens slept peacefully beneath the systems he spent his days maintaining. He looked toward the stars for a long moment. Then he smiled quietly and returned to reviewing repair schedules for the next morning. He had no idea that, deep within the palace archives, a queen had finally discovered the truth. She was not looking at the history of a project anymore. She was looking at the history of her own beginning. Queen Elora did not sleep that night. Long after the palace lights dimmed and the capital settled into silence, she remained standing beside the archive display. The final recording had ended hours ago, yet the words continued echoing through her thoughts. You were never meant to remember me. She looked out through the crystal wall of the chamber toward the city below. Countless lights shimmered beneath the stars. Entire generations had lived beneath her guidance. Entire civilizations had trusted her judgment. Yet the person responsible for setting her on that path spent his days repairing climate systems and helping children restart educational displays. The contrast felt almost impossible to accept. By dawn, Elora had made a decision. She left the palace without ceremony. No royal procession. No advisors. No guards. Only a simple transport vehicle and a destination known to very few people. The refugee district on the eastern edge of the capital. The district had grown over many years. Families displaced by environmental disasters, economic collapses, and political upheavals had found new beginnings there. The buildings were modest compared to the palace. Functional, practical, human, alien, mixed together. The district represented exactly the kind of future she had always hoped to build. As her vehicle arrived, morning sunlight reflected from rows of residential structures and community gardens. Citizens moved through narrow streets carrying supplies, opening shops, and preparing for another day. Then she saw him. Ethan Ward stood atop a maintenance platform repairing a heating unit connected to one of the housing complexes. His jacket sleeves were rolled up. A toolbox rested beside him. Several children watched nearby while he explained how the system worked. They listened with complete attention. Occasionally one of them asked a question. Ethan answered every single one. Patiently, kindly, as though nothing else in the galaxy mattered more than helping them understand. Elora remained motionless for several moments. This was not the image preserved inside Genesis' crown. This was not the brilliant architect standing inside a laboratory surrounded by researchers. This was simply Ethan. Older, quieter, still helping people. Eventually, he noticed her standing near the edge of the courtyard. His expression changed only slightly. No surprise, no alarm. Almost as if he had expected this day to arrive eventually. He climbed down from the platform and wiped his hands clean with a cloth. "Good morning, Your Majesty," he said. The title felt strangely formal now. Elora studied him carefully. "You knew?" Ethan looked toward the heating system. "About the archives?" She nodded. "Eventually, yes. And you said nothing." He smiled faintly. "The project was never about me." The answer sounded exactly like every document she had read. Exactly like every recording she had watched. For a moment, neither spoke. Children continued playing nearby. Garden sprinklers released gentle streams of water across rows of vegetables. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted from an open apartment window. Ordinary life continued around them. Finally, Elora asked the question she had carried since discovering Genesis' crown. "Why did you disappear?" Ethan's eyes moved across the district. Families, workers, friends, people building lives together. "Because they needed you," he said quietly. "Not your creator." The simplicity of the answer struck her harder than any revelation hidden in the archives. Ethan had never wanted recognition. He had never wanted authority. He had spent centuries protecting the very future he helped create by refusing to stand above it. For the first time since beginning her search, Queen Elora understood why the galaxy had never found the true architect of its most beloved symbol. He had been too busy helping people to tell anyone who he was. The conversation remained with Queen Elora long after she left the refugee district. Throughout the day, she attended meetings, reviewed diplomatic proposals, and listened to reports from advisors. Yet part of her mind stayed fixed on the image of Ethan standing beside a heating unit while explaining basic engineering principles to children. It felt strangely unfair. Entire worlds displayed her likeness in public squares. Historians wrote books about her leadership. Citizens crossed star systems just to catch a glimpse of her during public appearances. Yet the man who had given her the foundation for everything she became spent his mornings repairing equipment and helping strangers. That evening she returned to the palace and requested complete privacy. The command surprised her staff. No one questioned it. Hours later, she stood alone inside the Hall of Celestial Accord. The immense chamber was empty now. The crystal throne sat beneath the transparent dome while stars glittered overhead. Without crowds, without ceremonies, without music, the hall felt different. Smaller somehow, more honest. Elora slowly walked toward the throne and studied it in silence. Generations viewed it as a symbol of authority. Yet after learning the truth, she saw something else. Responsibility. The realization brought unexpected emotion. She understood now that Genesis' crown had never been about creating a ruler. It had been about creating a servant powerful enough to help others. The next morning, she returned to the refugee district without announcing her arrival. Once again, she found Ethan working. This time, he was repairing a water distribution controller near a community garden. Several residents greeted him warmly as they passed. Ethan greeted every one of them by name. When he noticed Elora approaching, he set aside a diagnostic tablet and smiled politely. "Good morning." Elora looked at him for several seconds before speaking. "I finally understand." Ethan's expression softened. "Do you?" She nodded. "You never wanted recognition." "No, you never wanted power." "Not particularly. You built something that changed the galaxy, then walked away." Ethan glanced toward the garden where families were tending vegetables beneath the morning sun. The goal was never to be remembered. The answer sounded exactly like him. Elora lowered her gaze. For the first time in many years, uncertainty entered her voice. "Then why did you kneel?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. The sounds of the district continued around them. Children laughing, water flowing through irrigation channels, wind moving through trees. Ordinary life. Finally he answered, "Because I was proud." Elora blinked. Ethan smiled gently. "Not proud of myself." His eyes moved toward the city beyond the district. Towers of crystal rose into the sky. Millions of people lived beneath them. "Proud of what you became." The words struck her harder than any revelation hidden inside the archives. Ethan continued, "When Genesis Crown began, nobody knew if it would work. We hoped. We tried. We made mistakes." He looked back at her. "Then you spent centuries proving that hope was justified." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt warm rather than uncomfortable. Elora finally understood something the archives could never fully explain. Ethan had not abandoned his creation. He had trusted it. And in that trust was a gift far greater than any throne, title, or legend. Standing there beneath the morning light, the queen felt tears gathering in her eyes as a single realization settled quietly into her heart. The man before her was not seeking gratitude. He was preparing to offer an apology. The apology came beneath a sky filled with morning light. For a long moment, neither Ethan nor Queen Elora spoke. Around them, the refugee district continued its ordinary rhythm. Children crossed pathways on their way to school. Garden workers tended rows of vegetables. Maintenance drones moved quietly between buildings. Life carried on, unaware that one of the oldest stories in the galaxy was reaching its conclusion. Ethan looked toward the horizon where the towers of the capital shimmered beneath the rising sun. Then he finally spoke. "I am sorry." Elora felt her breath catch. Of all the things she expected to hear, those words were not among them. "Sorry." Ethan nodded slowly. "When Genesis Crown ended, I left." His voice remained calm, but there was sadness beneath it now. "At the time, I convinced myself it was the right decision." He smiled faintly. "Maybe it was." His gaze lowered for a moment. "But there were days when I wondered if you would feel abandoned." The honesty of the confession struck her deeply. For centuries, entire civilizations had celebrated her achievements. Yet the man responsible for her beginning had spent those same centuries quietly carrying a concern no one else knew existed. Elora stepped closer. "I was never abandoned." Ethan looked up. She continued, "You left behind everything I needed." The morning breeze moved through the trees around them. Sunlight reflected from nearby windows. Somewhere a child laughed. The sound seemed to soften the silence between them. "The archives showed me what you built," Elora said. "But they also showed me why." Ethan listened without speaking. "You did not teach me how to rule." Her eyes glistened with emotion. "You taught me how to care." For the first time since she had found him, Ethan seemed unable to answer immediately. His expression softened. The years showed themselves briefly in his eyes. Not age. Relief. Then something happened that neither historians nor advisors would ever fully understand. Queen Elora lowered herself to one knee. The movement was graceful and deliberate. A few nearby residents noticed and froze in shock. Others stopped walking. Within seconds, silence spread through the courtyard. The most revered leader in the galaxy knelt before a maintenance technician. Ethan immediately shook his head. "No." Before she could speak, he gently offered his hand. "Please." Elora looked at him. Then she accepted the gesture. Ethan helped her rise to her feet. "You were never meant to kneel to me," he said softly. "And you were never meant to worship me." The words carried the same warmth found in every archive recording, the same warmth that had guided her entire existence. Ethan smiled. "You became exactly what the galaxy needed." For a moment, they simply stood together beneath the morning sun. No throne, no ceremony, no audience that truly understood what they were witnessing. Only a human and the life he had helped create. Above them, the sky stretched endlessly toward the stars. The same stars that had watched Genesis' crown begin. The same stars that had watched centuries unfold. Finally, Ethan glanced upward and smiled. Elora followed his gaze. The silence that settled between them felt peaceful, meaningful, complete. Across the galaxy, billions would continue honoring the queen they called a goddess. But she would always remember a different truth. The greatest thing a human ever created was not power. It was hope. And the greatest thing that hope ever learned was mercy.